At midday, a public road disappears as a presidential convoy is forced to stop, signaling a sudden rupture between authority and access. What looks procedural quickly becomes political, exposing how private barriers, paperwork, and timing can quietly rewrite power, normalize exclusion, and transform shared infrastructure into leverage. What does this moment demand from you when Ibrahim Traoré meets resistance that tests legitimacy, resolve, and the boundaries of lawful authority? Because what follows accelerates fast, revealing consequences that extend beyond a single gate to governance, trust, and who ultimately controls the commons. You are about to hear an account that carries weight because it addresses what many summaries avoid. It explains how a single obstruction reveals deeper rules about power, process, and accountability, and why surface readings miss the stakes. You will gain a clearer grasp of how authority is tested in real time, how documents can mask intent, and how decisions compound under pressure. This is not material for casual listening. If you stop here, it becomes easy to misread the episode as a local dispute or a colorful anecdote. Timing and legality can be engineered to shift control without public debate. It also obscures why responses that look restrained may actually be strategic, and why early signals matter more than later speeches. Missing these layers invites acceptance of partial narratives, borrowed certainty, and conclusions shaped elsewhere. The trade-offs faced by decision-makers, and the risks carried by ordinary citizens when shared assets are quietly reclassified. The value is not persuasion, but clarity that helps you judge what follows with steadier footing. Two facts matter immediately, and neither is comfortable. A public route that had functioned for decades was blocked without warning, and the obstruction was backed by documents that appeared formally valid. That combination is the reveal. When physical force aligns with paperwork, power no longer announces itself loudly, it operates quietly, through procedure. One detail anchors this shift: the road in question sat directly above a critical underground water pipeline feeding the capital's emergency reserves. Control of that land was not symbolic. The situation did not emerge from chaos. It began with a development boom on the outskirts of the capital, where land values rose faster than oversight mechanisms could adapt. Zoning decisions were processed quickly, oft undigitally, and responsibility fragmented across offices. A single authorization could change the function of shared infrastructure without public scrutiny. The escalation came from timing. The blockade occurred precisely when a state inspection was scheduled, not randomly. That meant someone knew the route, the schedule, and the significance of the visit. What looked like a private development dispute became a test of whether state movement itself could be redirected by non-state actors using legality as a shield. The first to feel the impact were not officials in offices, but ordinary residents dependent on the water system and transport corridor. Detours added hours. A convenience for a few translated into risk for many. This is where the issue hardened. It was no longer about a road, but about whether essential systems could be quietly enclosed. In that moment, Ibrahim Traoré faced a choice that went beyond enforcement. Immediate confrontation could validate the paperwork and escalate unpredictably. Misreaders' retreat preserved space to examine how authority had been hollowed out from within. The episode exposed a deeper vulnerability: when documents move faster than accountability. Infrastructure can be captured without a single law being openly broken. That realization reframes everything that follows, because it shows how control can shift before anyone notices, and why the response had to be calculated rather than loud. The story gains direction once a guiding perspective enters, not as a hero's flourish, but as a stabilizing lens. Observers inside the planning system described a pattern that had gone unnoticed for months: approvals that looked routine, files that moved quickly, and decisions that no single office fully owned. It was the first visible seam in a fabric already under strain. One early impact stood out. Within hours of the detour, emergency water logistics had to be recalculated. Tanker routes were revised, fuel costs increased, and response times lengthened. But it created measurable friction in a system designed to operate quietly. The point was not disruption for its own sake, but leverage created by narrowing options. A second confirmation followed from a different corner of the administration. Satellite overlays showed how new private corridors overlapped with legacy infrastructure in multiple districts, not just one. The overlap was legal on paper, yet dangerous in practice. It suggested a trend rather than a dispute, a method rather than a mistake. This is where the role of leadership mattered. Ibrahim Traoré did not treat the episode as an insult to be answered publicly. He treated it as a signal to be decoded. By stepping back, he allowed the underlying mechanics to surface: who authorized what, how information traveled, and which approvals were reversible. The response focused on understanding the map before moving pieces. The result was a shift in perception among those watching closely. What initially seemed like a minor confrontation began to read as an early warning about governance under pressure. When access can be redefined quietly, authority is tested long before it is challenged openly. The episode could no longer be dismissed as a small affair. It marked a threshold where routine administration crossed into strategic contestation. The sequence accelerated quickly once the initial restraint gave way to motion. Abrupt and unmistakable. A barrier rose where a public artery had always run. Orders were issued. No warning, no negotiation, just a physical halt backed by guards and paperwork. The moment mattered because it transformed an abstract risk into a visible fact. Movement itself could be denied. The next hours compressed decisions. Calls were placed. Not about the obstacle but about its authorization. Who signed? Under which mandate? The answers were hesitant. Explanations leaned on investment, incentives, and modernization language, carefully broad, carefully vague. That vagueness was the tell. It suggested not confusion, but distance between action and accountability. Pressure climbed. Maps were compared against older records. New corridors were laid over legacy systems. Not accidental. What had been framed as a luxury access routes add on top of essential infrastructure. That alignment shifted the stakes. Logistics and emergency response. A private convenience revealed itself as a strategic choke point. Then came the cascade. Missing files, incomplete archives, digital approvals without physical counterparts. Each absence multiplied suspicion. The process that was supposed to ensure transparency instead obscured it, fragmenting responsibility until no single office could answer for the whole. It was procedural, unfolding through databases, signatures, and timestamps. Reactions spread outward. Security units adjusted routes. Planners reviewed recent approvals. Analysts cross-checked server logs. The tempo increased, sentences shortened, decisions narrowed to essentials, cause followed effect in tight succession. A blocked road led to a delayed inspection. The delay exposed for Conwald pointed inward. The conflict expanded from a gate to a network. Aftershocks followed. Private security reinforced positions, not to defend property, but to anticipate enforcement. That anticipation confirmed intent. Preparations assumed confrontation, revealing that the barrier was never meant to be temporary. It was designed to test response thresholds and measure resolve. How far could authority be bent before it snapped? The human costs surfaced quietly. Detours added hours for tankers. Fuel consumption rose. Response windows thinned. For residents, these were inconveniences. For emergency planners, they were vulnerabilities. What could be absorbed once became dangerous if normalized. The timeline left marks that did not fade when the gate eventually opened. At this point, the story crossed a line. It stopped being about reclaiming a road and became about reclaiming control over how decisions propagate. Ibrahim Traoré's approach stayed calibrated, not because the stakes were low, but because they were systemic. Each move aimed to expose the chain rather than break it prematurely. The aftershock phase settled into a new rhythm. Oversight tightened, quiet signals replaced public statements. The immediate confrontation paused, but the contest deepened. What remained was a changed landscape, where every routine approval was now suspect, and where speed itself had become a liability. From here on, the issue could not be contained to a single incident. It had demonstrated how quickly a localized action could escalate into a structural challenge, leaving behind a timeline that redefined risk, authority, and the cost and attention. Before weighing numbers, it helps to reset expectations. What follows is not about dramatic statistics dropped for effect, but about measurements that anchor scale, speed, and human exposure. They show why this episode carried more weight than a routine dispute, and why it could not be managed as one. Start with the baseline. For roughly 5 decades, the route in question functioned as a public artery linking the capital to critical water infrastructure. Movement along it was assumed, planned for, and embedded in emergency logistics. The delta arrived in a single month, when paperwork reclassified access and a physical barrier made the change enforceable overnight. The shift was not gradual. It was abrupt, compressing decades of shared use into an instant loss of access. A second measure captures speed and intent. The blocking order appeared less than a day before a scheduled inspection, while internal communications later showed that instructions had circulated hours before the itinerary was finalized. It demonstrates Faucon-Walden coordination, not coincidence. In practical terms, it means response time for state action was measured in minutes, while preparation by private actors unfolded over days. The delta here is asymmetry. One side reacted, the other anticipated. Scale becomes clearer when infrastructure overlap is considered. Mapping comparisons revealed that the privatized corridor sat directly above a main pipeline feeding the city's emergency water reserve. Control of that strip of land therefore implied leverage over a system serving hundreds of thousands of residents. The implication is concrete. A single obstruction narrowed redundancy options across an entire network. The baseline of distributed access shifted to a delta of concentrated control. The human dimension appears in time costs. The enforced detour added approximately 2 hours to tanker and convoy movement during the inspection period. 2 hours may seem modest, but in emergency logistics it compounds quickly. Doctor fatigue rises, response windows shrink. Multiply that delay across repeated trips and the cost is no longer anecdotal. It becomes systemic friction imposed by design, not accident. Another number sharpened internal concern: 5 officials had prior knowledge of the inspection route. That small circle limited the potential source of leaks and transformed suspicion into an investigable problem. The delta here was qualitative but decisive. A broad administrative system narrowed to a countable set of accountability points. In governance terms, that contraction is powerful because it converts diffuse risk into traceable responsibility. Data integrity provided a final metric. Physical land transfer files were missing within days of the blockade, while digital records remained accessible. It indicates a gap between formal process and archival reality, suggesting that oversight mechanisms had been selectively bypassed. When documentation disappears on a scale of days rather than years, the pace signals intent. Taken together, these measures weigh heavily. Decades of access replaced by a month of privatization. A handful of informed actors shaping outcomes for a population orders of magnitude larger. None of these figures require exaggeration to matter. The quantitative picture does not scream crisis, it confirms vulnerability. It shows how small deltas applied at the right junctions can shift control over large systems without triggering immediate alarms. That is why the response could not rely on force alone. It had to address how numbers, timing, and access interact to produce leverage. There is a serious counterargument that deserves to be heard in its strongest form. Some observers argue that what happened reflects routine governance under growth pressure. Cities expand, land is reclassified, and infrastructure is modernized. From this view, private investment requires security, exclusivity, and predictable access rules. Paperwork exists for a reason, and if documents are valid, enforcement should follow procedure rather than emotion. The blockade looks less like capture and more like the messy friction of development colliding with outdated routes. That argument gains strength when one considers administrative overload. Planning offices process hundreds of approvals, often digitally. With limited staff and overlapping mandates, errors happen, delays occur. A road-changing status may be unfortunate, but not conspiratorial. Proponents of this view add that restraint by leadership risks signaling weakness, inviting future obstructions by others who test limits, knowing the response will be slow and procedural. A second counterpoint focuses on security. High-end developments often demand controlled access, especially near sensitive assets. Private guards, barriers, and rerouted traffic are common in many cities worldwide. From this angle, the incident looks exaggerated because of who encountered it, not because of what it was. Had an ordinary convoy been turned away, it might never have been noticed. Is proportional to visibility, not substance. These points matter because they highlight real tensions between growth, law, and authority, but they falter when placed against the full sequence. Routine governance does not rely on Falkenwalder inspection routes. It does not coincide with missing physical files days after a dispute. It does not align private access corridors precisely over emergency infrastructure without transparent safeguards. Most importantly, it does not produce coordinated defensive preparations anticipating enforcement actions that were never publicly announced. The security argument also narrows too much. Protecting residents or investors cannot justify leverage over systems serving entire populations without explicit oversight. When legality shields actions that increase systemic risk, legality alone becomes an incomplete test. What appears orderly in isolation becomes dangerous in aggregate. Placed side by side, both perspectives sharpen the picture. The counter-Gemiston explained how such an incident could be normalized. Understanding both does not force a verdict, but it clarifies the boundary between acceptable friction and structural vulnerability. That boundary is where the real issue sits, and where judgment must be made with eyes open rather than aligned to convenience. Everything changes once the hidden layer surfaces. What had looked like a dispute over access revealed a deeper test about information control. The barrier was not the most important element. The decisive shift came from realizing that movement schedules, inspection routes, and approval timelines had leaked in advance. That meant the confrontation was not reactive. Someone had treated state activity as a variable to be anticipated and managed, not respected. This reframed the entire sequence. The issue was no longer whether a road could be privatized, but whether state operations themselves had become predictable to private actors. Predictability is comfort in logistics. It is danger in governance. Blocked or rerouted ahead of time, authority loses its element of surprise and, with it, a core to love enforcement. The midpoint matters because it resets how early restraint is read. Stepping back was not hesitation. Who prepared defenses and who benefited from delay? Those reactions drew a clearer map than any document could. Where fear surfaced and where coordination existed behind formal legality. From here, the story no longer unfolds on the surface. The visible gate becomes secondary. The real contest moves into systems that rarely attract attention: data access, internal communication, and the quiet alignment between paperwork and force. Once that layer is exposed, the episode cannot be solved by reopening a road alone. The path forward shifts. Attention turns to consequences that reach beyond the original site and into daily life, markets, and regional relationships. What seemed localized now carries weight elsewhere. Because the mechanism it exposed can repeat in different forms. That is the threshold crossed at this point, where the narrative deepens and the stakes widen without announcing themselves loudly. The effects become tangible once attention shifts from mechanisms to daily reality. What unfolded after the midpoint did not stay confined to files, meetings, or corridors of power. It translated into consequences that different groups felt in distinct ways, each shaped by proximity to decision-making and exposure to risk. For the state, the immediate impact was pressure on credibility and control. When a public route can be blocked with apparently valid documents, every similar approval comes under suspicion. Ministries were forced to reach recent decisions, slowing routine governance and diverting capacity toward damage control. Not out of confidence but caution, Ibrahim Traoré faced a narrower margin for error because any visible misstep could reinforce the impression that authority was fragmented rather than firm. Businesses encountered a different reality. Logistics firms absorbed higher fuel and labor costs as detours stretched delivery times. Developers faced uncertainty as permits once considered settled were quietly reviewed. For compliant firms, this felt like instability imposed from above. For others, it signaled that shortcuts might no longer be protected. Investment decisions became more conservative, not because opportunity vanished, but because predictability did. For ordinary people, the effects were subtle but immediate. Longer transport times meant higher prices at markets as costs passed through supply chains. Water distribution schedules grew tighter during peak demand, increasing anxiety in neighborhoods already sensitive to scarcity. None of these changes arrived with announcements, reinforcing a sense that essential systems could be disrupted without public consent or warning. That perception erodes confidence faster than any single outage. At the regional level, observers took note. Infrastructure vulnerability in one capital raised questions for neighboring states facing similar development pressures. If access could be privatized informally in one context, it could be attempted elsewhere. Not because of its drama, but because of its plausibility. It demonstrated a method that travels easily across borders. The combined effect is cumulative. No single group bears the entire cost, but each absorbs a share that compounds over time. The state slows, businesses hesitate. People adjust expectations downward, the region recalibrates risk. This diffusion makes accountability harder, because harm is spread thinly rather than concentrated. Seen together, these outcomes underline why the episode mattered beyond its origin. It showed how leverage applied at a narrow point can ripple outward, touching institutions, markets, and households at once. Ibrahim Traoré's challenge was not simply to reverse an obstruction, but to restore confidence that shared systems remain shared. That is the enduring consequence. Once the idea takes hold that access can be quietly redefined, everyone begins to plan defensively. No actor truly stands outside the impact. One plausible path is a steady, constrained adjustment. Approval's slow, and informal capture becomes harder, but not impossible. Governance stabilizes at a higher level of caution, with fewer shocks yet persistent friction as systems recalibrate. The result is neither crisis nor clean resolution, but a narrower margin where mistakes cost more and vigilance becomes routine. A more hopeful path depends on follow-through. Legacy approvals are audited, and access to critical infrastructure is ring-fenced with transparent oversight. Confidence returns gradually as businesses adapt to clearer expectations on residents and fewer quiet disruptions. But direction becomes legible, and small wins accumulate into credibility. The worst path emerges if lessons fade, signaling that leverage works if applied discreetly. Fragmented accountability hardens, private barriers multiply, and essential systems become bargaining chips. When that happens, responses grow outer and riskier because soft tools have failed. The point is not to predict which path will prevail, but to recognize what pushes the system toward one or another. Outcomes hinge on consistency, not spectacle, and on whether early signals are acted upon rather than explained away. Preparing for all three paths requires attention to timing, documentation, and access because those are where leverage quietly forms. After tracing the mechanisms, consequences, and possible paths ahead, the question naturally turns inward. What does this actually mean for you, the person following this story to the end, rather than skimming headlines or accepting ready-made conclusions? If you are someone who follows politics, governance, or regional affairs closely, this episode offers an advantage and a warning at the same time. You can see how power often shifts through procedure rather than proclamation. The warning is pace. When changes happen quietly and quickly, yesterday's assumptions age fast. Staying informed means watching signals like access, timing, and paperwork, not just speeches or slogans. If you are affected indirectly through work, prices, or public services, the relevance is more practical than abstract. Small disruptions, longer routes, higher costs, or tighter supply are rarely random. They are usually the downstream effects of decisions made far upstream. Understanding that link helps set expectations and reduces the shock when adjustments appear without explanation. If you feel distant from the issue, it is tempting to dismiss it as someone else's problem, but distance is fragile. Systems that feel stable often depend on invisible agreements about shared access. The effects tend to arrive suddenly and without invitation. Not paying attention does not shield anyone from the outcome, it only delays awareness. Across these perspectives, one point holds. You are not powerless simply because you are not inside the decision room. Awareness itself is a form of leverage. It shapes how you interpret news, how you judge claims, and how quickly you recognize when something familiar starts to shift. Understanding the pattern is what keeps you from being surprised by the result. Solutions only matter if they can be executed. Slogans or declarations would not address the mechanics that allowed quiet capture to occur. What follows is a practical sequence focused on responsibility, timing, and measurement rather than intention alone. The first steps, it's at the center of the state. Leadership must order a bounded audit of recent land and access approvals tied to critical infrastructure, with a clear deadline measured in weeks, not months. Responsibility should be assigned to a small, named task group with authority to suspend questionable permits temporarily. Success is not measured by reports produced, but by a visible list of approvals reviewed, amended, or revoked. For Ibrahim Traoré, this step anchors authority in action rather than rhetoric. The second step belongs to institutions and businesses operating around infrastructure. Developers, utilities, and logistics operators need a unified access registry that flags overlaps between private corridors and public systems. Implementation should be immediate for new projects and retroactive for high-risk zones. Progress is measured by coverage, not compliance language, meaning how much infrastructure is actually mapped and protected from unilateral restriction. The third step involves citizens and local communities. This does not require mass mobilization, but simple, consistent channels to report blocked access, unexplained detours, or sudden changes in use. The metric here is response time. When reports are acknowledged and addressed quickly, confidence grows. When they disappear into silence, suspicion returns. A fourth, reinforcing step can strengthen the system. Independent verification, whether through regional partners or neutral technical bodies, helps ensure that audits are not selectively enforced. The measure of success is not endorsement, but transparency: what was checked, what failed, and what changed. The sequence matters because each step closes a gap exposed earlier. Leadership sets direction. Communities provide early warning. Verification sustains trust. Without execution, solutions collapse back into intention. Ultimately, the lesson is simple. Control over shared systems is preserved not by force, but by making quiet capture difficult to repeat. When processes are visible and timelines enforced, leverage shifts back toward the public interest. The image that returns is a quiet one, not the barrier itself but the moment when routine movement was interrupted and something ordinary felt suddenly fragile. Earlier, the episode showed how a small decision could expose a larger fault line. Now, that memory ray frames everything that followed. From the first halt, on a familiar route to the wider recalibration of authority, the journey has been less about confrontation than about recognition. What appeared manageable at the start revealed layers of dependence, trust, and risk that had been taken for granted. Step by step, the story traced how systems people rely on every day can be reshaped without noise, and how quickly that reshaping becomes consequential. Placed within that arc, Ibrahim Traoré is not defined by a single response, but by the pressure of choosing how to act when restraint and resolve pull in opposite directions. That choice carried uncertainty, cost, and criticism, yet it also preserved something less visible but more durable: the possibility of restoring shared confidence. The emotional weight rests here. This is not only about governance or infrastructure, but about whether silence becomes the default response to quiet shifts in control. The deeper question is whether attention itself can still function as a safeguard. Because once people stop noticing how access changes, the path forward no longer belongs to them. The closing thought follows naturally from that reflection. Every viewer arrives here with a different background, a different threshold for concern, and a different sense of distance from the events described. Because this story does not belong to a single audience or a single country. It belongs to anyone who depends on shared systems without thinking about who controls them. If this account felt worth your time, it may also be worth letting others encounter it without filters or shortcuts. Not as a call to agree, but as an invitation to look more carefully at how small procedural shifts can carry large consequences. Conversations that begin with understanding tend to travel farther than those driven by certainty alone. The most useful exchange is not applause, but reflection. How should authority protect common access without freezing growth? Where is the line between legal form and public risk? And what early signals deserve more attention than they usually receive? Those questions do not demand immediate answers. They benefit from many voices and patient discussion. Staying engaged in that dialogue is how attention becomes shared, and how quiet changes are less likely to pass unnoticed.